All right, good evening again. Hopefully third time's a charm. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Niagara Votes live stream, our broadcast of tonight's provincial election results, being brought to you by your Metroland and Torstar newspapers, the St. Catharines Standard, the Niagara Falls Review, the Welland Tribune, and of course our friends at Niagara This Week. I'm your host, Grant LaFleche, and tonight's broadcast is being brought to you by WeeStreem and producers Kevin Jack and Brandon Scram. And sitting beside me at the anchor desk tonight is Jeff Bolachowski. Jeff is the Standard's former politics reporter, and he's currently the media and policy analyst for the Niagara Strategy, or the Armstrong Strategy Group, based here in Niagara. Jeff, welcome back to the newsroom.
Nice to be here for the third time.
For the third time tonight. And as we noted before, if you caught the initial attempts at our broadcast, we did not mean to dress as the Bobbsey twins. It's just the way fate goes, hey?
Hey, third time's the charm, guys.
That's right. Okay. So we are now looking at 8:42. We're running a little behind on our broadcast tonight. Polls close in roughly 15 minutes, except for some districts in Ontario, which you've been following the news tonight. You will have seen that some of the polling stations in other communities have had technical problems. As far as we know, there are no issues in Niagara, and the polls should close at 9 p.m. There will be no extensions, and you have until then to cast your ballot. And Elections Ontario should be able to start cranking out results shortly after that. Tonight, barring any further technical difficulties, you're going to hear from our journalists in the field. We have reporters in all four Niagara ridings at all of the campaigns, and we'll be hearing from them as we move through the night. So I'm going to move over to our whiteboard over here just to give you a quick snapshot of the candidates, so you know who you're looking at. Excuse us. If we can follow me, camera guys. So you can see over here, this is the Niagara Falls riding, or St. Catharines riding. Jim Bradley, Liberal, is the incumbent. He's being challenged by Sandy Bellows from the Progressive Conservatives, Jenny Stevens from the NDP, and Colin Ryer from the Green. There are also a handful of other candidates we'll hopefully be able to get to throughout the night. Niagara West is represented by the incumbent Sam Oosterhoff from the PC Party. He's being challenged by Colin Frick from the NDP, Joe Kane from the Liberals, and Jessica Tillmans from the Green Party. Moving over to Niagara Falls, Wayne Gates from the NDP has been the MPP for quite some time. He's being challenged by PC candidate Chuck McShane, Dean Demizio, the Liberal, and Karen Fraser from the Green Party. And then finally, in Niagara Center, which has been a long NDP stronghold, there is no incumbent. The incumbent retired, and she is not running. That's Cindy Forrester. Hopeful for the NDP to keep the dynasty going is Jeff Birch. She's being challenged by April Jeffs from the PC Party, Benoit Mercier from the Liberals, and Joe Dias from the Green Party. So that's your slate of candidates for the night. And I just want to point out that we want to hear from you as well as we go through the evening. You can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Niagara Votes on Twitter, and we'll be hopefully looking at what you have to say throughout the night. Our first story tonight, though, is going to be in St. Catharines. And as I noted from the top there, the incumbent is Liberal MPP Jim Bradley. Mr. Bradley has represented this riding since 1977 and has long been regarded as a safe bet for the Liberals. Even when the Liberals happened to lose the election, Jim Bradley has continued to hold his seat. However, the Liberals have not done well in the polls this election, and Kathleen Wynne last weekend conceded that she is not going to win tonight. And so that has led many people to think that for the first time since 1977, Jim Bradley's seat may be in jeopardy. So we're going to join right now reporter Karina Walter, who is at Jim Bradley's headquarters, and she's going to give us an update on what's happening. Karina, can you hear me? Hi. Where are you? Jim Bradley. So what are Jim's feelings as we head into the next 15 minutes before the polls close?
You know, he's always before the polls close at 9. Everybody's anxiously awaiting the results. And, you know, it's this one thing that is the same every year is just that feeling of anxiousness. And he thinks the results will be coming in a lot faster this year because of the new electronic polling. So we'll see.
Karina, I guess Jim Bradley is one of the big stories for Niagara tonight because he has been an MPP for so long. What's the mood? Can you give us any sense as to whether or not people are grappling with the idea time since 1977 he may not be the MPP?
Well, I think really wait and here on Carlton Street at and we've been asked to head over where the rest of his supporters are party in private. This is how they feel, but they want him to have people coming in. So there's a few things that change this year, I think.
Did you get a sense, and I know what it is when you talked about campaigns, there's this, did you get any sense of how the night's going to go?
Really, and he talked about how a very friendly here with Jenny Stevens and with Sandy Bella happened, and he said that riding from some of the other ones in the province, and he thought that they could actually, that some of the other ridings could kind of look to St. Catharines as the way we didn't have, the nastiness that some of the other ridings had. He said that, they're all different political parties, but that, they've all
Okay, well, thank you very much, Karina,
together.
and we will be checking in with you again after the results come in. Thanks very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Moving on now to Niagara Falls, where MPP Wayne Gates, who is the NDP incumbent, has been challenged by Chuck McShane, and that particular campaign has been particularly acrimonious at times. And we're going to join now reporter Ray Spiteri from the Niagara Falls Review, who is in Niagara Falls. Ray, can you hear me? Okay, we don't have Ray. Ray, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. How are you, Grant?
Okay, we don't have Ray. We don't have Ray, unfortunately. So we're going to have to come back to that. Just let me ask the producers: do we have Ray on the line? We cannot hear Ray.
Yeah, we have Ray. Try it again.
All right, we're going to try Ray again. One of the issues with the campaign, and perhaps more than any other campaign in Niagara Falls, has been the heated exchanges between Wayne Gates and Chuck McShane. It began early in the campaign when Chuck McShane started to say that the Fort Erie racetrack was on life support, something that not only Wayne Gates took objection to, but several local politicians did as well. So, Jeff, when you look at the Niagara Falls race, I mean, do you think that Wayne Gates is in a position to hold his seat, or is it really the kind of thing where Chuck McShane may be able to ride the Tory wave and take Niagara Falls?
Well, there's always the advantage of incumbency when you're dealing with a candidate. Wayne Gates has withstood quite a few challenges from prominent conservatives in the area, and he's going into this in a situation where there's also a new Democratic Party wave. You figure in most elections the NDP is around 20 to 25% of the vote, and we've seen with the polls this time that they've got a much more significant share. So while McShane may have a wave behind him, so does Gates. So it's wave on wave.
What do you make actually of the NDP closing the gap so quickly and so resolutely in this election? I mean, this was, again, we've had this conversation in provincial elections before. It seems to be the Tories' election to lose, and as we get closer and closer to election day, their leads evaporate, and that appears to be, at least in the general polls, that seems to be the case. What do you think is the reason behind the NDP being able to close such a significant gap this time around?
Well, probably the biggest figure that I've seen out of the polling is that 80% of the electorate wants change. There's definitely an appetite out there to transition away from the existing government. Usually governments have a shelf life of about 8 to 10 years. The Liberals are on about year 15. So there's definitely an appetite to move away from the existing party. The longer the government lasts, the more groups they will infuriate with their decisions.
It's curious, though, because the PCs and the NDP are as far apart politically as you can get. It's not like they're choosing between two kind of versions of the same thing. You're talking about two radically different parties. When we look at the extent to which the NDP has closed the gap, does that mean to your point of view, does that mean that the Ontario voter is shifting left? Or are they looking at the PCs and saying, we want change, we just don't want the change represented by Doug Ford, so the only other alternative happens to be the NDP?
Well, I think what's happening is there's a war for the center going on right now. Normally that's the space occupied by the Liberals, they're kind of a center, soft, center-left party. But you saw under Kathleen Wynne that the party really moved strongly to the left, into the NDP's traditional territory. So now it's sort of a soft flip to the NDP for some of these Liberals. And the center is really unrepresented by any particular party. So it's all these sort of middle ground voters who are now having to decide, where on the spectrum do I fall? Where am I the most comfortable?
Right. Okay. We're going to move on now to Niagara Center, which is also a hotly contested riding in Niagara, perhaps the most hotly contested riding, since Cindy Forrester, the former MPP for the NDP, had decided not to run. And so we're dealing with no incumbent. We're dealing with Jeff Birch from the NDP, who is trying to become the next in a long line of NDP MPPs, including Mel Swart, Peter Cormos, and of course Ms. Forrester. And the Tories, trying to grab their wave that Jeff just mentioned, are represented by April Jeffs. So we're going to turn now to Tribune reporter Dave Johnson, who is in Welland and can update. Dave, can you hear us? Excellent. Dave, one of the things that has, and you and I talked about this before we sort of broke to go on our coverage tonight, was the amount of focus that the Niagara Center riding has gotten from the leaders, particularly from Doug Ford, who has been here multiple times. What do you make of the fact that the leaders have, Andrea Horwath, rather than NDP, and Doug Ford from the PCs, have visited the riding so often?
It makes me question whether the PCs think they can take this riding by putting Ford here. That he's been here a grand total of 4 times, once when he was running for the leadership, and 3 times since to help local candidate April Jeffs. And it just makes you wonder whether they really think by bringing him here and pushing April, whether they can actually take this riding from the NDP, who've held it for 43 years now through Mel Swart, Cindy Forrester, Peter Cormos.
Dave, what do you judge the chances are that the NDP dynasty can actually be broken? Does April Jeffs have a chance to break the orange wave?
I don't really think she does at this point, but I mean, anything could happen. But Welland typically goes NDP, and we've seen over the 43 years when it was the Welland riding on its own, and when it's picked up some of the other cities like Port Colborne and Thorold. Port Colborne used to be a big city with a lot of unions in it as well, so there's a traditional sort of NDP vote there as well, and somewhat liberal as well. So I don't know that April can actually break the NDP sort of, I don't want to say stranglehold, but the stronghold that this riding is for them.
All right, thank you very much, Dave, and we will check back in with you once we get some results. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
If Jim Bradley is Niagara's longest-serving MPP, if you cast your eyes to Niagara West, you're going to find its youngest. Sam Oosterhoff of the PC party won a by-election last year at the tender age of 19, becoming the province's youngest MPP. And he's currently in a riding where he is faced with a slate of the youngest candidates, not just in Niagara running against him, but in the entire province. And we're going to try to reach now Bill Sawchuk, who is our St. Catharines Standard politics reporter, who is hunkering down at the Oosterhoff campaign. Bill, can you hear me? Okay, we don't have Bill yet. So one of the...
Bill Sawchuk.
Bill, we heard you. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, great. Bill, just give me a quick sense as to what you're seeing at the Oosterhoff campaign tonight. And this is a riding that's generally regarded as pretty safe for the Tories. Does Mr. Oosterhoff and his campaign feel comfortable they're going to win tonight?
Well, they won't actually say that. They were mostly talking to his brother, who helps with the campaign. Has been a campaign manager before. He's not this time. But he talked. They were still knocking on doors, making sure the vote was out there. I don't think they're taking anything for granted. Would appear from the numbers last time, it was a landslide. That it's a very safe seat for him, and he seems to have kind of made a good impression. I mean, he was young and is the youngest ever for an MPP, and he seems to have kind of people seem to be accepting him as doing the job and as being an effective MPP. That's the impression I have, from being around town, and I live in the riding, so I kind of tend to keep a close eye on it. So he's in very good shape. If he is upset, it'll be a monumental upset, but that doesn't seem to be. That's certainly not the mood here. It's optimistic, but not overconfident.
One of the things that's remarkable about Mr. Oosterhoff when he both ran for the PC party and then later in the by-election, Bill, and you saw this because you live in the riding, is the strength of his ground game, the number of volunteers he has, the people he can mobilize to knock on doors and reach out to voters. Do you think he's done the same thing for the general election, and will that pay off for him when polls close here in the next 5 to 10 minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. He hit, and the other thing is he doesn't take any of, because this is a very dispersed riding, and he ends up he knocks on doors and on all all the small towns. He gets as many as he possibly can, and he does have a very energetic and kind of dedicated team that really believes in him. It's a humming machine right now out here for him.
Excellent. Okay, thanks very much, Bill, and we'll check back in with you once results start coming in and we know how the riding fared. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Talk to you later.
Thanks a lot. So now that we've done a quick cap of the races locally, Jeff, give me your thoughts just on what you think is going to happen tonight. We're now looking at, it's now 8:56, so we got 4 minutes before the polls close. What's your expectation as to what's going to happen both in these 4 races and provincially?
I think locally, the 2 races to watch are going to be St. Catharines, I think, is going to be the really interesting one. Niagara Center sort of in second place. Provincially, I think you may see a call fairly early if the polls are correct in their assessments, because we've really seen 2 classes of polls. The popular vote, which shows a horse race, and then the riding by riding polls, which are showing a particular party potentially winning a majority in a blowout fashion. Which is the Progressive Conservative Party.
And I guess it's worth noting for those who follow the polls, and we were talking about this before we went on air, excuse me, that you can look at the popular vote, and that shows us a statistical dead heat in many cases between Doug Ford and Andrew Horwath, but that does not translate into votes necessarily, or at least into seats. That's not the way our first past the post system. That's not how we end up choosing our MPs. So that statistical dead heat may not mean anything.
No, this has happened actually multiple times in Canadian history. You know, the late great Wilfrid Laurier himself in 1896 lost the popular vote by several points and still won a majority because his vote was so concentrated. So it's really based on the ridings.
Do you expect that may happen tonight? That Doug Ford, and I've certainly heard some commentary to this effect, that despite the popular vote polls, that he may actually win that way. He may win the seats even if he loses the popular vote.
That is certainly a possibility given some of the polls we're seeing, especially if there's a surge of young voters for the new Democratic Party or a surge of Liberal turncoats flipping over to the NDP. There's a real risk that the PCs could lose the popular vote and still win the majority.
What's your sense of the Niagara ridings? We know that Jim Bradley is potentially at risk. I've seen some polls that put him as low as 3rd, depending whether you believe those polls to be accurate. We just heard from Bill Sawchuk in Niagara West, where Sam Oosterhoff seems to be safe. But in the other ridings, there's certainly a question mark as to who may win. How do you see the 4 ridings playing out?
To me, I think St. Catharines is going to be the most interesting one because this is an election where no Liberal is safe. If they win 5 to 6 seats, they're going to be counting their angels today. And Jim Bradley has survived a lot of elections that have knocked off lesser Liberals, including wave elections that have seen the Liberals bounced completely into opposition. But this one looks like a massive wave of blue and a massive wave of orange coming in to swamp the red tide. And if Jim Bradley hangs on tonight, I think he's going to be counting his blessings.
Do you think that, for instance, Wayne Gates may hang on, or that Jeff Birch will continue the NDP dynasty in Niagara Center?
I think Jeff Birch has a bit of an in-baked advantage because of the sense that Niagara Center has been an NDP riding. But there's also the issue of realignment. The riding has shifted its boundaries a little bit and encompassed a new chunk of St. Catharines for the first time in quite a while. So now you have this new block of votes that's going to be accounted for. So is Niagara Center now going to be a more conservative-leaning riding, or is it up for grabs? Certainly the party leaders seem to think so. And while the advantage lies with Birch, there is a bit of a chance that the Conservatives will come up the outside.
Well, we heard that from Dave Johnson from the Tribune, who's in Niagara Center. Doug Ford was there 3 times, I think. Andrew Horwath was there a couple of times, and they keep hitting that same riding. They didn't really spend much time in St. Catharines. They didn't spend a lot of time in Niagara Falls. They kept hitting Niagara Center.
And that shows you that their internal polls are telling them something, that the riding's in play and that there's a chance to make a real go of it.
Okay. It is now 9 o'clock exactly, and the polls have closed. So if you haven't cast your ballot, you're not going to be able to now. In a few minutes, I'll be stepping away from the anchor desk as we wait for results to come in, and I'm going to be helping put the newspaper together for tomorrow. But before we do, I wanted to draw your attention to a story that we broke in this day's paper. You'll see it in the Standard, the Review, the Tribune. You'll even see it in the Toronto Star. And that's about this woman, if we can pull her up on the screen, gentlemen. Okay, you can't see her at the moment, but her name is Donna Bacon. Donna is 55 years old. She lives in St. Catharines and has been politically active for most of her adult life. She views voting as a civic duty, and she goes out of her way every election to ensure that she can cast her ballot. But today, Donna Bacon wasn't allowed to vote. She took ill and is being treated at the St. Catharines Hospital in St. Catharines, but the hospital is just across the riding boundary into the riding of Niagara West, which means Elections Ontario refused to send an agent to give her a ballot so that she could vote through their home visit program. Because Donna Bacon got sick, and because the hospital is a mere stone throw away from the riding boundary, she has been disenfranchised. Since we broke this story last night, I've been receiving emails from other Niagara residents and Ontario residents who find themselves in Donna's position. Like her, they want to vote. And like her, they have spent days on the phone with Elections Ontario trying to find someone that can help. And that help has never come. We live in an age of apathy where voter turnouts are historically low and cynicism is common. Many people simply disconnect from the political process because it doesn't think it represents them or assists them in any fashion, and that tends to suppress voter turnout and the number of people who bother to cast their ballots. And here we have at least one woman who is desperate to vote who can't. It's shameful that in 2019, somebody who wants to exercise their most basic democratic right cannot do so because of arbitrary rules in our electoral system that prevent her from getting a ballot. As voters, we should insist that whoever wins tonight will change the electoral rules to make sure that no one's voice gets silenced on election day. We deserve better, and Donna Bacon sure as heck deserves a lot better. We'll be back soon with further election results. Okay, we're back. The results are coming in quite fast. For those of you who don't know, well, you would have known if you voted today, you would have seen a difference in the balloting system, where before you had a paper ballot and that paper ballot would be manually counted. It was all being done electronically. So we expected results would come in quick, and they are coming in very quick. So right now on the screen, you're looking at Niagara West. Is that what we've got there? Niagara West. Sam Oosterhoff is well ahead. Jeff, can you, what are we looking at in terms of numbers there?
I can't quite make out the numbers from where I'm sitting, but anything less than an Oosterhoff lead would be an absolute shock. He looks like he's up by at least 54% of the vote from what I can see, sort of squinting at the screen here.
Okay, so I pulled them up on my laptop here. So Sam Oosterhoff is ahead with 51% of the vote. Curtis Frick from the NDP is second place, but he's a distant second with only 30% of the counted ballots. So there's no real surprise there. We expected that Sam Oosterhoff was going to do well.
Niagara West is a rock red conservative riding. I think any NDP pickup in there would have been a remote chance.
Right. So we'll take a look now at Niagara Falls, if the guys can put it up on the screen for you. Well, I mean, here is... you touched on this. There was going to be potentially an orange wave. We're seeing it in Niagara Falls. Wayne Gates, it's early yet. There's still a number of votes to come in, but he has 56% of the vote, with Chuck McShane right now a distant second at only 29%. But you should point out, as you see on your screen, that's only 770 votes for Wayne Gates, 399 votes for Chuck McShane, and everybody else kind of following in a distant third and below. Are you surprised that Wayne is hanging on? You did talk about the power of incumbency early on.
I'm not really all that surprised that Wayne Gates would hang on. I would expect that margin to narrow a little bit as the night goes on, especially as some of the more rural areas of that riding come in. But at the same time, Wayne Gates has been a very strong representative in opposition, and I think he's going to be very hard to topple.
So we said at the outset that one of the races to watch tonight was Niagara Center, and that'll be pulled up on your screen if the guys from WeeStreem can pull it up for you. But I'm looking at these numbers now, Jeff, and they are close. Jeff Birch from the NDP has 39.49% of the vote. That's 805 votes counted so far. And April Jeffs from the PC party is at 37.71, or 769. This early in the game, that's pretty close. That's a very narrow
that is
lead
a squeaker.
that Mr. Birch has on.
Well, you can see that the party leaders saw something going on in that riding and saw it, and Doug Ford saw the chance for a pickup. And I think the interesting thing here is you have a candidate for the NDP whose base is basically in St. Catharines. Jeff Birch is a St. Catharines-based candidate.
That's correct.
And most of the riding is based in South Niagara.
But at the same time, April Jeffs is currently the mayor of Waynfleet. She's not in the core of the riding either. And it's sort of interesting that the two people who are the leading candidates aren't necessarily the ones who are they're the ones who are leading, but they aren't Wellanders. They're not from the heart of the riding.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a distinction that's often made in Niagara between are you from North Niagara or from South Niagara, and North Niagara often translates to are you from St. Catharines.
True. Okay, we're getting our first results from St. Catharines as well. As I noted at the outset, some of the polls that I had seen coming in tonight showed that longtime Liberal incumbent Jim Bradley was a distant third behind Sandy Bellows of the PC party and Jenny Stevens from the NDP. The results, you can see them on your screen now. Jim Bradley is actually down. He's at 27.16% in third place. The lead goes to Jenny Stevens so far from the NDP at 926 votes, or 38%, with Sandy Bellows following second at 29%. Again, this is early, and they're only talking a couple of hundred votes difference at this point, Jeff. But are you surprised that the NDP seem to be pulling ahead, at least this early in the game, when you would have thought if St. Catharines was going to go another way, it might go to the Conservatives?
You would have thought, especially with Sandy Bellows, who last time she ran gave Jim Bradley his closest shave ever. She came within 4 points of bumping him off. But at this time, we've just seen such a large movement of the Liberal vote to the NDP that there seems to be a chance. Jenny Stevens was a very strong candidate for the NDP last time, did well around the 20% mark, and that gives her room to grow in this riding and win sort of a three-way split between three competitive candidates.
I mean, interestingly, when I look at these numbers, I mean, Jim Bradley is in third, and he's got a ways to go if he's going to catch Jenny Stevens, but he's not that far behind Sandy Bellows. She has 722 votes to Jim Bradley's 658. Are we fair at this point to count him out, or could there be enough of a surge as these votes come in that Jim Bradley might make it out alive?
Well, it's always hard to make assumptions based on early balloting. The one thing that might save individual Liberals tonight is the individual popularity of specific members of Parliament. For example, a Yasser Naqvi or a John Fraser may be able to hang on based on their personal charisma.
Do you think that Kathleen Wynne last weekend coming forward and saying, look, I'm not going to be the premier anymore. We're not going to win this election. Is that going to be enough to save Liberals who might otherwise have been in trouble?
I don't think so, because it's also going to open the door to people to say, well, they've already conceded the election. Why would I want to waste my vote on them?
So I'm just giving another quick scroll here. Looking back at, Niagara Center, we're now talking about less than a 10-vote difference as these votes are coming in. It's actually a margin of 8 votes between Jeff Birch and April Jeffs.
CP24 declares Ford the winner.
So our editor, Greg Furminger, has just informed me that CP24 is declaring Doug Ford the winner. I'm going to pop into the provincial results page here to see just exactly what they're calling. We've been looking very closely at local results. So if we look at the provincial page, which the guys will pull up for you on the screen in a moment, the PC Party of Ontario has 231,438 votes. That gives them 40.24%. The NDP are second with they're about 30,000 votes down, or 35%, and the Liberal Party is 100,000 votes plus behind them. When you're looking at this, are we talking a majority government with these numbers?
I think we're looking at potentially a commanding Ford majority.
Really?
Even with the popular vote tied, Ford has such an in-baked advantage that there's almost no way that he loses at this point. The NDP could win by 5 points and still not form the government.
In the popular vote?
In the popular vote.
According to Elections Ontario, the numbers that you're seeing on the screen, if they can pull them back up for them, guys, you'll see that first column is the number of seats won or leading. That's 67 seats for the Tories and 33 seats for the NDP. So that's going to be a hard margin at this point, don't you think, to
It's going to be
overcome?
very difficult to overcome, and it's simply because the NDP vote is so inefficiently distributed. They're not doing well in the 905. They haven't been able to penetrate Eastern Ontario. They're very strong in Southwestern Ontario, but if you win every Southwestern Ontario seat by 50 to 60%, where's the rest of your popular vote going? You're just running up the margin in safe seats.
So if we're looking at the Niagara, this is sort of an interesting thing. If we're looking at the Niagara ridings, we have two, at least, well, Niagara West is clearly going to go Tory. I'm going to take another peek here at Niagara Center just to see where things are unfolding. If CP24 is correct and we're looking at a Tory win for Doug Ford, Jeff Birch is still holding on to a bit of a narrow lead. Could we see a situation where the province has gone Tory, but Niagara has gone orange?
That's
largely?
entirely conceivable. That happened to my old hometown of Windsor, where the government went Liberal and everyone else went New Democrat.
What's the consequences of that for Niagara if we only have the one representative? And Greg has informed us again that the projection now is a Tory majority, which you just deduced.
I've called it again.
So, but what does it mean if we're looking at a Tory majority, but we're then also looking at a Niagara, which has largely gone in another direction? Will that have any impact on Niagara in terms of either its voice at Queen's Park, what kind of funding and programs come down here, the influence of Niagara at Queen's Park?
I think at this point it means that the voice of Niagara at the table in terms of at the government is going to be young Sam Oosterhoff, the youngest MPP in Ontario. It's going to really mean he's going to be the one who is representing this region with the government. And you're also going to have 3 MPPs whose ridings may be overlooked when you have the government going around to talk about where they really want to focus. Those voices will be somewhat more out of focus compared to the areas where the Conservatives are strongest.
I'm looking again at Niagara Falls. And Wayne Gates, he's opening up his lead kind of substantially now. His margin is 2,262 votes ahead of Chuck McShane, who seems to be struggling to catch up. Which really only leaves us now in terms of a question is St. Catharines to see whether or not Jenny Stevens' lead is going to hold, or whether or not Sandy Bellows is going to apparently be a beneficiary of this wave. And it's close, but Jenny Stevens is still in the lead. Jeff, we're looking at Jenny Stevens with 3,335 votes, or 38%, to Sandy Bellows with 2,739 votes, or 31%. That's about a 600 vote difference at this point. Does that surprise you at all, that Jenny Stevens is out front when we look at a potential majority for Doug Ford?
It's a little bit of a surprise. You would have thought that St. Catharines' most natural inclination would be to go to the Progressive Conservative Party. We've typically bounced back and forth between the two, and to see us go towards the New Democratic Party is a little bit of a surprise, but also a testament to the strength of Jenny Stevens as a candidate, and the fact that the NDP seems to have put some focus on the Niagara area. Now, I think the real one to watch is going to be Niagara Center as to whether Jeff Birch can pull it off, because that's going to be an interesting situation if St. Catharines is NDP and Niagara Center is Progressive Conservative. That's almost unprecedented.
So we could see a split.
We could
Niagara
see a
Falls
split.
goes NDP, St. Catharines goes NDP, the other two ridings of Niagara West and Niagara Center go Conservative.
Until about 5 or 6 years ago, that was unprecedented. Welland was sort of the NDP island in this region.
So, more generally, Jeff, what do you make of I mean, Doug Ford is a divisive person, to put it mildly. All the leaders kind of have a popularity problem. He, maybe outside of Kathleen Wynne, has the worst of it. Why do you think he has been able to make these kind of inroads with all the chaos that goes on inside the Progressive Conservative Party, from the fall of Patrick Brown, the fall of Rick Dykstra, the scandals that seem to nip at their heels, from the 407 data scandal to the way some of the candidates were selected? There just seem to always be problems internally, and yet we are potentially looking at a Tory majority tonight.
The gist of it is that voters are mad and they want to throw a hand grenade into the system, and Doug Ford makes a pretty fine hand grenade.
Well, I mean, what does that mean policy-wise? I mean, one of the criticisms that the Tories have faced since he became leader was they didn't really have a comprehensive plan. They didn't have what they call a costed plan. You don't really know where the money's coming from. You don't actually know how they're going to pay for anything. What is this actually going to mean for Ontario in terms of what's going to happen next?
In terms of policy statements, nobody's really sure, just because policy has played such a very minimal role in this campaign. I mean, this election was 100% about personalities and 100% about the issue of trust and change. Who do you trust to deliver change was the question on voters' minds. And it seems to have been a battle between the New Democrats and the Conservatives on that front. And when it comes to that battle, the Conservatives just have a better machine. They have more money to roll that machine out because they simply have a larger fundraising advantage.
Right.
And their vote is more efficiently distributed across more ridings to actually carry that through.
So, taking another peek at Niagara Center, Jeff Birch is sort of white-knuckling it so far. He's ahead by 951 votes, so his lead is opening up a little bit. What happens to Niagara if it gets divided along the lines we just suggested, where two ridings may go blue and the other two go orange?
I think you're going to see a lot more attention given to West Niagara at this point. You know, there's a lot going on in West Niagara, and you're going to have your only government MP, who is Sam Oosterhoff, the youngest MPP in the Ontario legislature at this point. So there's going to be a lot put on him. And the interesting question is, how is he going to get along with the Ford camp? Because we did see a bit of a schism between Ford and the social conservative camp, to which Sam Oosterhoff is known to have certain ties.
Yep. Well, that was when they got rid of
Tanya Granick-Allen.
Tanya Granick-Allen, who was kind of the flag bearer for the social conservatives inside the PC party. Do you think that Mr. Oosterhoff will be offered a ministerial position? I mean, is given that this is going to be a brand new government, are they going to have no choice but to give him a ministerial position?
I think that's hard to say. I think they may look at some of the Hamilton areas and sort of consider us Hamilton Niagara. Mm-hmm. You know, Sam Oosterhoff is a very promising young candidate, but he's also a young man, and I'm not sure he's necessarily within the Doug Ford inner circle. I'm not sort of privy to the relationship between the two at that point. But I think he's also going to have a lot of expectations put upon him as either one of two or potentially the sole government MPP in this region.
What happens to the Liberal Party now? If sort of the elder statesman of the party, like Jim Bradley, ends up losing his seat tonight, how do they rebuild? The worry amongst Liberal circles certainly was, if they drop below 8 seats, they lose official party status at Queen's Park, which means they lose a great deal of provincial funding to carry on. They're truly going to be in the woods in a way that, you know, maybe only the federal Tories after Brian Mulroney left office have seen before. What do the Liberals do at this point?
I mean, if these results hold, they're going to get Kim Campbelled. They're in big trouble. So at this point, they've basically got no choice but to spend some time into the wilderness and figuring out what went wrong and how can we rebuild our party in a manner that's more in touch with what Ontarians want, and how can we get past the stink of failed Liberal campaigns, which
how
delivered us
difficult
this.
is it to rebuild a party when you don't? If they lose official party status, which we can't say just yet, but if they do.
Well, it can be very tough. I mean, you saw the Progressive Conservatives lose official party status, and we had all this rigmarole with the Reform Party, which led us to Stephen Harper's party, which then came roaring back a few years later and became Prime Minister.
But isn't it fair to say, I mean, the federal Tories as they are now, or as formed as they were under Stephen Harper, that was not the classical Progressive Conservative Party that had been a contender or a governing party in this country for a very long time. That, as you say, what became an amalgam of social conservatives, Western Alienation Party in the form of the Reform, what was left of the old PC party. If they lose official party status or otherwise get close to that tonight, is the Liberal Party as we know it dead? And in whatever comes out of it down the line, much like the federal Conservatives, the provincial Liberals will be something else other than they are now?
It's really hard to say. This is absolutely unprecedented. The Liberals have never taken a drubbing to the point where they've lost official party status. For a long time, they've been one of the two official governing parties in this province, so the idea of them losing this much just puts them in completely uncharted territory. So they're going to have to do a little bit of soul-searching and figuring out, are they going to rebuild, or is something else going to happen? I think the more likely situation is they're going to find a way to rebuild. They're going to hope to find a way to do what Justin Trudeau did when he came from being a 30-seat MP third party at the federal level to Prime Minister.
I think the key part there was they still had federal funding. I mean, the Liberals had been cast down, and as the Stephen Harper Conservatives were accedant, but they still were an official party in the federal system. If the Liberals get that hammered tonight, they're not even going to have access to that kind of base funding in order to operate.
And that makes it a million times harder. It's hard to see them going away into the wilderness altogether simply because they do have an organization, but it makes it a lot harder for them to find candidates. It makes it a lot harder for them to access funding. It makes it a lot harder for them to be taken seriously. I mean, you could end up in a situation where you have Premier Doug Ford, Opposition Leader Andrea Horwath, and then every day the Liberal leader sort of holding press conferences saying they're very seriously concerned about the things Doug Ford is doing, but nobody's really listening because they're the third party.
What does it say to you about the opposition to Doug Ford? And there was certainly a considerable amount of it. That the accusations range from some level of corruption to sexist to just unfit to govern. He's on the path now to form a majority. What does it say about the opposition to him, be it the Liberals or the NDP, in terms of get their message across, be able to explain why this person shouldn't be premier when he in fact looks like he's going to be?
I think one thing it shows is that left-wing parties just haven't figured out how to fight a populist. It is very, very difficult to compete with the anger of voters, and when you get a candidate who successfully taps into their anger, they are extremely hard to beat. It is almost impossible to beat a populist at his own game unless you channel a little bit of populism yourself and get down into the mud. And it's very hard to do that when you're an establishment party or have something in common with a party that has just been getting under voters' skin for the past 15 years.
The comparisons have been made through the campaign. I suppose they're going to be made even more now that he's won. Is Doug Ford Ontario's Donald Trump?
I don't think he is. I think one of the key differences is Doug Ford does not seem to have made any particularly racist comments during the course of the campaign, whereas what you see with Donald Trump is a very concerted anti-immigrant stance. Mm-hmm. They certainly channel some similar attributes. They definitely have a way of tapping into voter anger. They definitely have a way of positioning themselves as the voice of suburbia. That's really Doug Ford's brand, is he is the candidate of a suburban rage.
But isn't it interesting, though, because the Tories' base support for years, the divide in this province has been the urban centres went Liberal, the rural centres went Conservative, and that, I mean, for years that has been election after election after election, that's what the divide is, and you're suggesting that divide's been broken now.
And to some extent, the elections are often fought in the suburbs, especially the 905, the Toronto suburbs.
Right.
And Doug Ford is very, very plugged into that 905 world. He's a candidate who doesn't like bike lanes. He's a candidate who doesn't like, houses for autistic children to work their way back into the community. He's a candidate who has problems with the downtown latte-sipping elites who, hold their pinkies in the air, as he likes to say.
I got to say, and this is one of the things that kind of makes me, as a journalist and watching this on the outside, sometimes just makes me bananas, which is, Doug Ford is somebody who was born into wealth. He has always been wealthy because of his father's company. And you saw this with Donald Trump in the United States as well, not to push the comparison perhaps too far. But the idea that somebody who is ostensibly very wealthy, who was born into advantages that most Ontarians do not have, to then rail against the quote-unquote elites when by definition somebody in that position is an elite. He is a politician. He is somebody with a great deal of money. Why is somebody in that position, who is as elite as it gets, is able to carry that argument forward in such a way that people listen and believe it?
Well, in some ways, it's the natural outcome of political processes that have been in the works since Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Especially you see it in the move towards free trade, where the decision was made to liberalize everything and position business as champions of the worker rather than unions. And you've seen sort of a decline in unionization and an increasing urge to position business people as the champions of common folk. And that's really what comes through in Doug Ford, our sort of idealization of the job creator as the champion of the little guy. Whereas he can come from wealth, but because he's a job creator, he can effectively say, I've created jobs, I know what a business is. You know, I may be a bit of a bare-knuckled guy, but I'm your bare-knuckled guy, and I'm going to go punch out your enemies.
All right, so let's take another quick turn around the dial here just to see what we're looking at in terms of results. So we'll start with Niagara Center, which is the most contested race tonight. And Jeff Birch is still in the lead. His lead is widening now. He's up to 45% of the vote so far, 13,343 votes. April Jeffs is now, approaching 3,000 votes behind, 2,700 votes behind at 10,628. So that's not settled yet, but it looks like Mr. Birch is at least getting more comfortable in his lead. Let's take a look at Niagara Falls, which was the other race to watch tonight. And Wayne Gates has his lead's getting a bit mammoth now. 51% of the vote, more than 20,000 votes for Wayne Gates, 13,900 votes for Chuck McShane. We'll take a look at Niagara West, although I don't think there's going to be much of a surprise there. Mr. Oosterhoff is similarly way out in front. He's got more than 50% of the vote cast so far. Curtis Frick from the NDP is way, way behind. He hasn't even cracked the 10,000 vote mark yet, which leaves us with St. Catharines and the fate of Jim Bradley, the MPP for St. Catharines since 1977. And if I can actually just get to the totals, you're looking at them on your screen, and I will be looking at them. No, that's a Renfrew. That doesn't help us at all. There we go. Okay, so Jenny Stevens is out front, but if you look at those numbers, Jeff, she's not walking away with it. I mean, she's some 5% or so above Sandy Bellows, so that still is probably too close to call, don't you think?
I think that's much too close to call, and it's fairly consistent with some of the polling I'd seen, which was about a 5 to 7% Jenny Stevens lead. And it's really a chance for us to sort of reflect on the legacy of Jim Bradley, who would have been the longest serving MPP in the legislature had the Liberals gone back into office again. So this is looking more and more like his swan song, and it's interesting that he chose to go into this election, which could have been very bad for the Liberals, rather than do what some of the other incumbents did, which is retire and exit with grace.
Do you think that he fought it because he thought he could win, or did he fight it because he was being loyal to the party? Did he fight it because that's just what he does, and he can't, he's sort of like an old boxer. He can't do anything else but fight?
I think it's hard to say. The interesting thing with Jim Bradley is he has such loyalty from the community, and over 40 years he has survived things that no Liberal had any right to survive. He has survived through Liberal wipeouts, Liberal majorities, and he's always been a rock-solid part of this legislature. Until this anti-Wynne wave that seems to have come in and swept away the Liberals almost as a whole. I think it's what you've seen with Jim Bradley in the last few years is he's somewhat fallen out of favor with the current crop of Liberals at Queen's Park. He was no longer in cabinet. He was sort of moved out of the prominent roles that he was once in under even as late as Dalton McGuinty's administration. But I think it's also worth remembering that when he was representing St. Catharines, there was a time when he was probably the greatest environment minister that Ontario had ever had.
That's right, and he's also held the post of transportation minister. More recently, he didn't have a ministerial portfolio, but he was in cabinet nonetheless, almost like I always call him the elder statesman of the Liberal Party, the kind of the one that everybody turns to. And there's not a decision that hasn't hit Niagara in the last term of government that hasn't involved Jim Bradley in one way or the other. Even when you talk to people on the Go file, when you talk to the Minister of Transportation, he will say, yeah, I couldn't take a step at Queen's Park without Jim Bradley chasing me, trying to say, you have to bring Go to Niagara, you have to bring Go to Niagara. How much not to cast any aspersions on Miss Stevens or Miss Bellows, should either one of them win tonight, but how can somebody fill those kind of shoes? And it's not just that Jim was an effective representative for the city, but he had all of those years of experience. I mean, who knows the corridors of government as well as Jim Bradley when it comes to trying to get something for your community?
Nobody really does, and that's just something you have to learn with experience. You'll go in and you'll have these enormous shoes to fill that Jim Bradley is leaving behind, and there's no way you can do that in your first term. It takes some time, it takes some absolute dedication, and it takes some real going out there and going to bat for your constituents, and knowing that you got to keep in mind each and every day that that's why you're there. They're the ones who put you to the dance, and they're the ones you've got to serve at the end of the day. And no matter which party you're from, you got to admit that Jim Bradley has been one of the greats for a long time, and in some ways it's tragic to see him go.
Did he lose because Jim Bradley lost this election, or did he lose because the Liberals lost this election?
Looking at some of the numbers, he seems to be overperforming the Liberals by quite a bit. I think Jim Bradley's brand is stronger than the party's brand, but at the end of the day, the leader and the party have a very strong influence on voters.
Should the Liberal? I mean, it's interesting. I had a long conversation with Jim last weekend after Kathleen Wynne had admitted she wasn't going to win this election, she wasn't going to be the premier, and he said to me that when he was going door to door, and certainly others of his Liberal colleagues seemed to encounter the same problem, which was they went door to door and they were being told by voters, well, I like you, I want to vote for you, but I can't vote for Kathleen Wynne. What was it about Kathleen Wynne that she became such an albatross for even popular Liberal candidates like Jim Bradley?
It's really hard to say. Part of the problem is she came in very late into a government that had already sort of gone past its sell-by date, inherited a lot of the problems that Dalton McGuinty had created, and then over the next course of 5 years, decisions made by the Liberal government came around and alienated various other interest groups, sections of the electorate, and that accumulates over time. She's part of a track record of candidates who are female premiers who come in late in a party's mandate and inherit these problems, and then go into the election and get basically ejected by voters angry with what their predecessors did. Kathleen Wynne is a fighter. There was a lot of talk going into this election that she was potentially going to step down and let another candidate run, but she seems to have declined to do that. She thought that she could very well win this election, but it seems like she's miscalculated, and it certainly seems that voters have decided we've had enough, the time for change is here. And when they decide the time for change is here, it's very hard to fight against that mindset.
You've said that a couple of times, that there was this appetite for change. What was driving that, do you think?
I think a lot of it is just inertia. Like I said, governments tend to last about 8 to 10 years before voters get fed up and decide they want change. It's a testament to the Liberal war room that they lasted 15.
Do you think Ontario knows what kind of change it wants, though? I mean, one of the arguments certainly that Liberals were attempting to push forward, and clearly by these numbers it was not a terribly successful argument at that, but the idea was, look, the Ontario economy is doing relatively well, job creation is up pretty well everywhere. Certainly we can argue about the efficacy of carbon taxes, but air pollution has certainly improved substantially since the Liberals have been in government. So when Ontarians look at Doug Ford and they want change, do they actually know what kind of change they want? Or is this a reaction of, I want change for the sake of change, without thinking far enough ahead to know what that's going to be?
Well, I hate to second guess the voters, but that's often the case when it comes to change elections. It's simply, I want change, this guy looks like change, I'm going to go for change, and we're going to see what change is. Sometimes there are voters who will just go out there and vote for change for the sake of change. Often voters will go out there and vote for the reputation of a party. The Progressive Conservative Party has the reputation of being the fiscal conservative party for Ontario. There's a lot of concern right now that Ontario is going back into deficit. There's a lot of concern right now that Ontario is running up an extremely high debt load. And when people are looking to a fiscal conservative party, the first place they're going to look is the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. And that's true even though all three parties are pledging to run multi-year deficits in this election, which sort of raises the question of, where are all the fiscal conservatives in this election? Because they were notably absent.
That is interesting. Do you think that the PC party, at least in this incarnation, has given up being the standard bearer of fiscal conservatives?
I think they saw that they got into some trouble with that during the last election when Tim Hudak ran on his Million Jobs plan and the pledge to trim the fat from the public service. I think there was a large backlash to that, and I think they kind of shied away from this idea of, we're going to advertise our rampant cuts to public services. So I think any government that gets in is going to have to get a bit of a dose of fiscal realism when they see what the books look like and the fiscal situation that Ontario is in. I mean, we're in a situation now where the economy is pretty good, we're growing, unemployment is lower than it's been in probably the past 10 years, and yet all three governments are talking about, we want to run a deficit for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And that portends very badly for us when we go towards a period of economic downturn, because that's when you'd expect to run a deficit. And what do you do if we're already running a deficit and running up the debt?
Okay, so we're just going to do another quick turn around the board here, and then I'm going to be stepping away from the anchor desk to file some stories for the paper for next day, and then, of course, in our online edition, which you can see at the St. Catharines Standard.ca, NiagaraFallsReview.ca, and the Welland Tribune.ca, and the Niagara This Week websites as well. And then we'll be back after 10:15, 10:20 for more conversation with our reporters in the field, more analysis from Jeff Bolachowski on what this means. So just for context, to win a majority government in Ontario, the party has to win minimally 63 seats. According to Elections Ontario, the PC party is currently has won or is leading in 73 seats. The NDP is winning or has won or is leading in 38 seats. And the Liberal Party, they're coming very close to that 8-seat limit, Jeff. You need 8 seats to be a official party in Ontario. Right now, the Liberals have won or are leading in 8. We don't have all the results to all the ridings.
And don't forget about the Green Party.
Okay, yes, and the Green Party looks like, well, they're leading with 1 seat. So they actually may finally get that barnacle-like foothold in the legislature. After
Mike
all this
Schreiner
time
has been trying for a very long time, and Guelph was his chance for a breakthrough, and it seems like he's on his way to making it.
He has indeed. So if 63 seats is what's needed for a majority, it looks like the PC party are comfortably on their way for that. Interestingly, and we talked about this a couple of times already tonight, the popular vote is very close. The PC party has got 39.99, almost 40% of the popular vote. The NDP is only at 34.5, so then they're only a few points back. But you can see the seat difference is substantial, 74 to 37 at
Even
this point.
that is a lot broader than we've seen from some of the polls recently. We've seen some polls that suggested a tie, which may suggest that there were some voters out there who were simply shy about telling pollsters we're going to vote for Doug Ford.
Well, and that's often the case, isn't it? I mean, provincial political polling has kind of been an abysmal mess for several elections, and they keep getting core elements of it wrong. And that's one of the things that is true, isn't it? If a party has an unpopular leader, you may think, oh yes, I'm going to vote for Kathleen Wynne or Doug Ford or something, but I'm not going to tell you, the stranger at the door, the stranger on the phone, that that's where my vote's going.
One thing we're going to have to take a look at when this is all over is what the turnout was, whether there was an increase in Conservative turnout, or just how the parties did relative to the years past. But one thing with these sort of new right-wing populist candidates is that they often defy conventional assumptions about politics. People tend to assume that the Conservatives are going to do badly with New Canadians. Well, Doug Ford seems to have a contingent of New Canadians who are very fond of him and very interested in social conservative ideas. People assume Doug Ford's going to do badly with millennials. Well, there's evidence out there that suggests millennials are very amenable to this sort of right-wing, anti-trade, conservative approach.
All right, so our last little turn around the dial, and then we're going to take a short break. Niagara Center, Jeff Birch is his lead continues to climb from the NDP candidate. He now has 44% of the vote, or 16,122. That again, he's still sitting slightly above 2,700 vote lead over April Jeffs from the PC party. We go over to Niagara Falls, and this is kind of a romp for Wayne Gates at this point. He now has more than 50% of the vote. I just don't see how Chuck McShane makes up that distance at this point.
Another
Similarly,
radical victory for Radical Wayne.
Yeah. Did you see, by the way, the Twitter account somebody had made just dedicated solely to Wayne's mustache?
Absolutely. It's probably the most glorious thing I've ever seen.
Sam Oosterhoff, again, no surprise here. He's sitting strong with 51%, just over 51% of the vote in Niagara West, so he's in no danger. And again, in St. Catharines, which is maybe our biggest political story of Niagara for the night, Jim Bradley certainly looks like he's going down to defeat tonight. He's in third place. Jenny Stevens from the NDP is in first place so far with 37% of the vote. Sandy Bellows second with 32%, and Jim Bradley is at 24%. So we're going to keep displaying these results for you while we take a bit of a break from the anchor desk, and then we'll be back shortly with more analysis and more commentary from our reporters here at the Niagara Votes 2018 News Desk.
your mic's off.
Turn them off.
Just so you know.
So, thank you all. It's just such a privilege to be here with all of you, and I love you, every single one of you. I really do. Thank you. And let me begin. I've said it's a difficult night. It is a difficult night. I know it's a difficult night. You've been working so hard, and to all of the people, I'm going to talk to everyone. Let me begin, as I do, by acknowledging the many Indigenous people on whose territory we meet tonight, most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And our democracy is strong, and because of that, let me congratulate Doug Ford. I've spoken to him, and I wish him well. And I have committed to work with him to make this transition as smooth as possible. And now I trust that the rancor and the polarization of an election campaign can give way to the necessary civility of well-run government as he deliberates, as you deliberate, Doug, and search for the best decisions and solutions for all Ontarians. My team kept asking me yesterday who I'm going to be talking to tonight. And yesterday I couldn't fully answer that question. And this morning I figured out why. Because I'm talking to all of you in this room, but all of you in the province. And I love you. This is not a concession speech. I conceded I would not be Premier days ago. So this is my chance to say thank you for allowing me to be your Premier, and most importantly, for letting me connect with so many of you for the last 5 years. This has been the greatest privilege of my life, and the best part of my job is connecting with all of you. So tonight, I'm talking to you. Some of you watching tonight are watching from campaign rooms, from bars, and victory halls across Ontario. There's a candidate with you who put his or her name on the line, took that risk, and with your help, knocked on thousands of doors. You made phone calls, you cooked meals, you hammered in signs, and you met fantastic people every single day who came to their doors and told you about their lives just because you were there and you asked. You had the privilege and the joy of being part of a team, and I want to thank you for being involved. There is simply no election campaign without you, regardless of party stripe. To the candidates in those rooms, if you won, congratulations. Yes, congratulations. You are in for a surprising, rewarding, challenging experience, and I wish you well as you work for your constituents and in the best interests of all Ontarians. Enjoy tonight, and well done. If you didn't win, you and your team are disappointed tonight. My heart goes out to you. But even as I say that, I know that you've had great moments, you've had great fun, and you've had a remarkable experience. Through tears and hugs, know that you have been so important to the debate in your community. And I'll bet some of you are already thinking about doing it again. That's right. That's right. That's right.
for change, as you can see. But I wanted to know that. And so when you get that from various people out there who will say, and not many of them are going to say, well, I'm not going to vote for it. It'd be nice to, and so on. But the reception was very nice. And I knew from looking at those provincial polls, and I read the polls before, I knew down here that they would permeate here. I knew many of those people were offering very kind words to me for people who are not going to vote in this election Liberal, and were not going to vote for me in this election, and they wanted to see change. So thank you to those people as well, and the people who work for the other political parties. It's difficult to get people to work for political parties these days, and all the candidates are going to be happy. Now, well, about I looked at the I guess the percentage of the vote. We're 18% provincially. We're 26% here. So we were 8% higher here. If we were many of us, maybe all of us, were not totally I'm totally surprised by the result. I said to many of the campaign workers, we could finish first, second, or third. It was really out of our control. When it ultimately came to it, was out of our control. When the polls are at 18%, you have a very difficult time overcoming that, and we did. But what a magnificent campaign. I think we had as good a campaign as you're going to see, and I want to thank each and every one of you. There were some who were there day and night, put their heart and soul into it. Others were able to help whenever they could, and that was great. Some of you were here today, were here at the first campaign I ever ran, and I mean the first campaign, way back. And I'm extremely grateful to those of you who have been here for all those years. Second, though, I'm equally thankful to all of you who have joined on, some just this campaign, and it made a huge difference. It's been a genuine privilege to be able to serve for 41 years as a member of Provincial Parliament for St. Catharines. I mean, that is person who's been elected to congratulate that person in person. At the present time, Jenny Stevens is about 1,500 votes ahead in St. Catharines. So I'll be going down to Jenny's headquarters later on. I'll be giving her a call and I'll be congratulating her. She knows she can count on my support in the transition. That's very important to be able to have a transition from one person to another. And I certainly will be working very closely with her. I wish her the very best as she deals with the issues that are here. She'll be a member of the opposition, it appears, from the results that are there. But I'm sure she will give her best shot at it, and I want to actually both the other candidates that I know started the campaign as friends. Sandy Bellows is a friend to start the campaign. Jenny Stevens is a friend to start the campaign. There was no acrimony among the three of us and by the way, the Green Party candidate who was not known to us before the campaign. There was no acrimony. We were friends to start and friends at the conclusion. And St. Catharines has actually set a very good example for much of the province in that kind of campaign taking place, because it was not that way in a lot of the ridings out there. The democratic process is great. How many countries in the world do you have a peaceful transition from one government to another? Not many countries in the world where it's genuinely a fair election. This was genuinely a fair election. Sometimes we've benefited from strategic voting. Well, this time we didn't benefit from strategic voting, and so I can't complain. I heard some people say, well, you're going to, that strategically people are going to vote for the NDP to keep Mr. Ford out as Premier. Well, in other years they've voted for us in strategic voting, so that's just the way it is in a democracy. So I'm really pleased to be able to have been serving with so many of I have municipal people here. The mayor's with us today. He's been great to work with as our mayor of St. Catharines. His father, by the way, was fantastic on making up those big signs on so many occasions. But to all of you, thank you. It's always a disappointment if you don't come first. But I want to tell you that it's a good feeling to be part of the democratic process. There are others here, as I say, who work very hard. Some come in, some are former employees who come in from virtually all over the province to work on election day, at the very least, and on other times, and I'm grateful to them. To run, Cuthbert, the president of the association, Gord Foster is back there now. He's still working the numbers. Lindsay Miller was front row and center. Was a central person. Brody Longmuir, a young person who's come along and contributed a lot. You can't get into the Dan Gordon from my office. I mean, these are people who are there day and night, slogging it out. There's a lot of grimy work in a campaign. It's not glamorous. And they were the ones slugging it out on my behalf, going door to door, knocking, putting up signs, dropping pamphlets, and we were actually dropping pamphlets, a few of us last night, to about 10:30 at night, sneaking up and hoping not to into townhouses as we went through. But it wasn't to be there. And as Ron and I discussed at the first of the campaign, we knew it would be an uphill battle at the beginning. But also, we thought we had a shot at it then. And to be repetitious, we knew when we fell to third place in the polls provincially that it wasn't to be. No matter what we would do here, and we ran a magnificent campaign here, no matter what we were to do here, we weren't going to win. But I'm a great believer in the democratic process, and I can't say how much I'm proud of that. John Turner, when he lost overwhelmingly as Prime Minister, and he kept his own seat at Vancouver Quadra, but he said that night, the people have spoken and the people are always right. And in democracy, that's correct. The people are always right. Whether you and I agree or not, that's something else. But the people, as in a democracy, the majority or the plurality, as it turns out, make a decision. And I respect that very much. I respect all members of Parliament. I actually got a phone call from a former Conservative member of Parliament who said he was phoning me to wish that I would win tonight, and he said I was the only Liberal who was going to phone in. I have many friends on all of the three parties represented in the legislature, and I watched some of those ridings. Even those who are not Liberals, I saw some of them winning. I said, good for them. And throughout the Niagara Peninsula, we'll be working hard to ensure that, first of all, that our party makes a comeback. We always have to start from the grassroots again. It often takes a defeat of this kind in the province. I hope we're able to keep 8 seats somewhere in the province. The breakdown here was such we had a pretty well a three-way race here. In some parts of the province it was a little different. It was a two-way, and we're able to hold on to some of those seats, I hope. I really do, some of my colleagues who are there. So I want you to enjoy the food, the beverages, the food, the camaraderie, and to say that it's been a great run over those years. Again, as I say, I look out and see people whose hair was either dark or it wasn't in existence when we started out. And today, the color of hair is different, or there may not be hair. But they're great people. And again, you could go on forever thanking people. But you really have to know how lucky you are when you're a candidate and you have so many people who have faith in you and who work hard on your behalf. It's a tough grind, and especially when it's election after election. Some of them are easier than others, and when you're cruising to victory, those are the easier ones. Ones like this are really the tough ones, and I really appreciate everything that you've done. So do enjoy yourselves. There's a municipal election campaign coming up, so those of you who want to get involved in independently and not as party people independently municipal campaigns, go ahead. You've had some time that you've been able to work on it so far with this particular election. Our headquarters has got the total still going. To those who made a financial contribution, thank you for that as well. I should mention that as well. But there's Ron. I actually have a tape, believe it or not, of the speech I made in 1977 when I won. And it sounds a little bit like this one, though, but not quite. And I got to remember, Ron Machishita will remember, there's Cuthbert, whose father was a big conservative in town. And I had Cuthbert and Walker and who else was there? There were 3 people in there who had to hide because they took a picture of
And we're back with Niagara Votes 2018, your provincial election results being brought to you by your Torstar and Metroland newspapers in Niagara. That's the St. Catharines Standard, the Niagara Falls Review, the Welland Tribune, and of course our friends at Niagara This Week. And I'm joined, of course, by Armstrong Media and Policy Analysis, Jeff Bolachowski. We've been here watching the results all night. We had to take a quick break while I did some work for tomorrow's newspaper and get some of our other coverage together. And now we're back as we know what the results of the election are. And we're going to run you through those results, both the results provincially, the results locally. It's been significant change, in almost every riding in Niagara, Jeff, and as well change in overall government. Bullet points are Doug Ford and the PC party have won a majority, forming the next government at Queen's Park. And while Sam Oosterhoff in Niagara West has held on to his seat as a member of the PC party, every other riding in the region, that's St. Catharines, Niagara Falls, and Niagara Center, have gone orange. They have voted NDP. And amongst our political casualties is St. Catharines, longtime St. Catharines Liberal MPP, Jim Bradley, who has lost his election and lost the seat that he has held since 1977. So we're going to take a really quick look at our results board and let you know what the results are. I'm just going to switch microphones. Sound good there, fellas? Okay, so really quick on the board, you can see the names in purple circled here are those who won. This is St. Catharines. This, of course, here is Jim Bradley, who, as I said, was the MPP since 1977, and he has now lost. He got roughly 24% of the vote. These numbers are not right up to date. When we updated our board, there was still a handful of ridings left to report. Jenny Stevens represented the NDP. She's a city councillor for the ward of Meriton in St. Catharines, is going to be our next MPP. She had more than 36% of the vote. And Sandy Bellows, also a city councillor, she came in at 33% of the vote. So this was actually the tightest race in St. Catharines tonight. Niagara West, a second one on the board here. This is no great surprise. Sam Oosterhoff and the PC party walking away with it with more than 52% of the vote. None of his competitors were close. Mr. Frick from the NDP, he came the closest, I suppose, in this drubbing, probably just riding the NDP wave that got them into the official opposition at Queen's Park. Niagara Falls, the incumbent, he was in fact the only incumbent for the NDP that won tonight, Wayne Gates. He had more than 50% of the vote, very comfortable win. The PC party's candidate, Chuck McShane, a distant third at 35%. Of course, Niagara Center, this is the one that we thought was going to be the one to watch, and Jeff Birch from the NDP has won with 44% of the vote. April Jeffs, the mayor of Waynfleet, with 37%. And I'm told now we have Ray Spiteri on the line. I'm going to switch mics. Ray has been down in the Niagara Falls campaign, and we're going to talk to him now. Ray, can you hear me?
I can.
Fantastic. So Wayne Gates has walked away with it by a pretty comfortable margin. What's the reaction from his campaign so far?
We spoke about 5 minutes ago with his family on stage, and he was pretty humbled by the significant victory. He mentioned something to the effect of it may have been the most votes that a Niagara Falls riding candidate has ever received in this riding. So he was expecting a pretty tight race, but it certainly wasn't.
And you and I talked about this before we began our coverage tonight. Of all the ridings in Niagara, the one in Niagara Falls was the most contentious. It started with Mr. McShane's statements that the Fort Erie racetrack was on life support. Can you describe for us just the tone and timbre of this particular race, which set it apart from the other three?
It sort of mirrored the provincial race, the leaders race with Mr. Ford and Miss Wynne and Miss Horvath. It had a nasty tone to it. I mean, there were allegations of lawn signs being placed on people's lawns without permission. There was allegations from one candidate against another that they doctored a video to make a misleading point. One candidate even confronted another in the parking lot after a debate. So, I think Mr. Demizio and Mr. McShane could sense that Mr. Gates had probably a pretty big lead to start with, and maybe tried to cut into that with some a nasty tone, but it didn't seem to resonate. Mr. Gates mentioned that during his victory speech. He said basically his positive campaign is what resonated and might have led to an even bigger margin of victory this time.
One of the things that we've been discussing on the show tonight, Ray, has been Niagara has largely voted orange while the rest of the province has ostensibly gone blue. What is the fact that Niagara is, from your point of view as a longtime political writer, what do you think this does for Niagara now that, for instance, Niagara Falls has gone NDP again, so has St. Catharines, so has Niagara Center, and these three large ridings do not have an MPP on the government side of the floor?
Well, it's an interesting point that you make, because I spoke with Wayne immediately after he got off the stage, and I asked that question. I said, you say that you've been an effective MPP in another majority government, a Liberal majority, and this is going to be a very different majority. How is that going to work? And I mean, he stuck pretty much to his talking point, saying he's still going to fight for Dole, he's still going to fight for the hospital, he's going to fight for local issues. And he mentioned that there may be strength in numbers in Niagara. I don't know exactly what he means by that, but he says that there's so many MPPs here that maybe Niagara's voice will be heard loud and clear because of those strengths in numbers. But only time will tell, I guess.
All right. That's Ray Spiteri reporting from the Niagara Falls campaign. Thanks for your work tonight, Ray.
Thank you, Grant.
All right, so we do have other reporters who are going to be reporting in to us later tonight, and of course one of our big stories tonight is the defeat of St. Catharines MPP Jim Bradley for the Liberals, who held his seat since 1977. Our reporter Karina Walter is on her way back from interviewing Mr. Bradley and being able to she'll report to us both about his campaign and the changes in tonight's election. You can jump on Karina's Twitter feed, and you can see her recording of Jim Bradley's concession speech. We just aired it on this live stream about 5 minutes ago, and during that speech, Mr. Bradley said he was actually heading to visit Jenny Stevens, who, as we just told you, has become the new MPP for St. Catharines. The city councillor for the ward of Meriton is now the city's MPP. Jeff, when we were talking before and about the NDP, and it's just there is this stark contrast that Niagara has gone orange while the rest of the province has voted overwhelmingly blue, giving Doug Ford a majority mandate. And I think some people may be surprised by it, because certainly as the campaign went on, the polls showed the distance between Andrew Horwath and Doug Ford shrinking, but that did not translate into seats tonight. So what were people missing when they were looking at those polls, do you think? And why couldn't the NDP make enough gains to win more seats in the House tonight?
I think they came close. You saw them in the lead in quite a few polls in sort of the middle part of the election. And then I think you saw the debate really become the starting point for the stalling out of Andrew Horwath's momentum. And there were a couple of things. First off is Doug Ford's team wisely pivoted to focus on not just Doug Ford himself, but the progressive conservative crop of candidates. And with that allowed them to concentrate on the NDP crop of candidates, talking about, for example, the candidate in the GTA who would not wear the poppy, or the one who was accused of posting a Hitler meme on her Facebook, which really gave the sense that PC party prepared, NDP unprepared. And I think the other one that really hurt Horwath was the wedge issue of labor relations, in which she was called out by both sides because she took off the table the idea of back-to-work legislation in the event of labor disputes. Well, if there's one thing Ontarians don't like, it's labor unrest. So which gave sort of the impression that perhaps Andrew Horwath hadn't thought her policies through, that maybe she's going to give too much leeway to big unions at a time when people are worried about the province's finances.
The other issue there, I think, is worth noting is polls are notoriously difficult to read. I mean, often polls, unless you're dealing with something that's drilling down to a riding by riding breakdown so that you can actually see how many seats a particular party may win, the popular vote poll, and we talked about this in the first half of the show, doesn't necessarily show you who's going to win. And yet you actually can see in the popular vote, if we look at the provincial-wide results from elections in Ontario, there's not a huge difference in the popular vote. I mean, the Tories have more, but not a substantial amount. But the difference in the actual number of seats won is markedly substantial.
Yes, it's about a 6-point gap right now, but the seat gap is about, the Tories have roughly close to 2/3 of the seats at this point. And a lot of that is a distribution. Ford is doing really, really well in the 905. The Progressive Conservatives have crushed it in the 905.
What did people miss when they were, again, it's interesting because people will look at this and go, well, it seems so close. I mean, the last Maclean's poll had them had Horwath at 38, Doug Ford at 38. I'm just looking at the latest results now from Elections Ontario. So the PC party is leading or winning in 74 seats. You only need 63 to form a majority government, and the NDP have 40. What will the NDP have to do you think, to assess why they couldn't get over the hump this time around?
Well, they've got to figure out what exactly their systemic weaknesses were and how they can go around to fix that. Part of the problem with the NDP is anytime they move to the center, their base decides, no, you're not pure enough, we don't like you anymore, you can't do that. This time they ran an unabashedly left platform, and even then they came into a spot where centrist voters says, no, we don't like that, you can't do that. So the NDP is in a tough spot. They have a very loud left-wing base that doesn't want them to move to the center, and yet most Ontarians live in the center.
The Liberal Party right now are leading or winning in 7 seats. They need 8 to be an official party.
Not looking good for the red team.
Not looking good for the red team. We're right now at 7,616 of 8,419 polls to go. So I guess it's not impossible that they might creep back up to 8, but it looking increasingly
unlikely.
Grim. What do you think is the future of the Liberal Party? What's going to happen now? Kathleen Wynne has stepped down as leader. They've lost their most senior and experienced MPP in Jim Bradley. So what happens for them next?
Well, they're going to have to regroup and A, figure out who their next leader is, and B, figure out a strategy to get that 8th and 9th seat back, try and get themselves back into official party status for the next running. And it's going to be tough. If they're not an official party, that just puts them completely out of the running in a lot of ways. But it's hard to figure out where they go from here simply because this is so unprecedented for the Liberals. They have a strong organization and they have strong supporters throughout the community. And their vote share is not horrible. They got about 19 to 20% of the vote. They're not the Green Party, for example.
Right.
But the fact that they got wiped out as an official party portends very, very badly for them.
Again, for those who may just be joining us, the PC party has won a majority government in Ontario, winning 73, 74 seats. You only need 63 to form a majority government in Ontario. The NDP did very well tonight, but not anywhere close enough to challenge to form government. And of course, the Liberal Party has lost, including St. Catharines MPP Jim Bradley, who has held that seat since 1977. And we're just awaiting the arrival of Karina Walter, our reporter on the scene. I understand that she's here, so she'll be joining us shortly to talk about what's happened to Jim Bradley. And she's here now, so she'll step into Jeff's chair if you want to just move around the table. We'll play a little bit of musical chairs here really quickly.
Play a little bit of musical chairs.
Hello.
Hello. So you were at Jim Bradley's campaign headquarters through most of the night. Just walk us through really quick how that went down tonight. He lost in pretty dramatic fashion.
Yes, and he was at his own campaign office on Carlton Street while the results were coming in so that he could watch them live with a small group of people who've been on his campaign team. And then as soon as the results came in and I guess he digested them, he came over to the St. Catharines Curling Club on Grantham Ave where the rest of his supporters were waiting. People were disappointed, but also I think practical about it. When he gave his speech, he talked about how there was this tide across the province that was happening. And one of his closest campaign team supporters was saying to me that it was important that he know that it's not a personal thing, that this was just part of this tide that was rolling across the province.
Did you get a sense from him early on? I know we talked at the beginning of the show. Did he have a sense that this was coming? That the Liberal Party was doing so poorly, and to the point where the now former leader and former Premier Kathleen Wynne had said, "Yeah, we're not going to win." Almost a week before the election. Did he have a sense that this could happen?
Well, he said it was either going to be a celebration or a wake. So,
That's
but-
not a lot of middle ground there.
no, and he was just anxious to see the results. I think there was a general sense in his camp that something was different this year. I think, as I mentioned on the phone before, normally in the past our reporters have been able to just kind of stay at his campaign office while the results are coming in, and this year we were encouraged to go to the Grantham Club where everybody else was hanging out, because I think they did want kind of that privacy this year. So I think there was a understanding that something different could happen.
Now, you recorded and broadcast his concession speech on your Twitter account. We showed it on the live stream shortly after you posted it, and it struck me how upbeat he sounded, considering that he's lost the job he's held since 1977. Talk to us a little bit about that concession speech and what Jim had to say and what message he was trying to convey to people who had, some of whom in that audience had been with him since the beginning.
Yeah, and one of the supporters that I talked to has actually been campaigning for him since he was a city councillor or a city alderman back then at the time. So we're talking more than 41 years ago when they were planning out their campaign on the guys in the guy's basement. And he was saying, Jim Bradley is just really astute, and he realizes that this is what happens in politics, and sometimes you get caught up in these waves. I had that impression too, that there were some people who had tears in their eyes, but there wasn't like at all out bawling or anything. And I think that is because people understood that something might happen. One of the things that he said in his speech was that as he was going door to door, people were saying to him, we like you, but we're looking for change this year. So people were still showing that they respected him, that they appreciate some of the things that he's done over the decades, but they really just wanted change this time around.
Right. And obviously you haven't had a chance to speak to Jenny Stevens. Our colleague Alan Benner is at the Jenny Stevens campaign, and we're waiting to hear from him. But you have been you're our City Hall reporter. You've been covering City Council of which he is a councillor for Meryton Ward. What do you suspect she is going to bring to the job? And how does she fill the shoes of somebody like Jim Bradley, who Jeff and I said at the beginning, who knows provincial government better than Jim Bradley at this point?
Well, I think there's going to be, anybody who steps into that role after Jim Bradley's had it for 41 years is going to have a bit of a learning curve, and he was saying that he will be there to help her and to help her with that transition. So I think having somebody like Jim Bradley who's open to that, it's not an acrimonious relationship. He said that they're both friends. And so I think that's going to be very helpful for her. I think, she's been a dedicated councillor in Meryton, so hopefully we'll see that when it comes to, her time at Queen's Park.
The story that you've already posted that's on our website now, and you mentioned this at the outset as well, Jim Bradley talked about how the St. Catharines riding campaign was not a terribly acrimonious one compared to, we just spoke to Ray Spiteri from the Niagara Falls Review talking about just how vitriolic the Niagara Falls campaign reached, including candidates kind of squaring off with one another in a parking lot outside of a debate.
Wow.
What did Jim say about the tone and timbre of this particular campaign?
He mentioned it in his speech to his supporters at the curling club, but I also had a chance to speak with him a few minutes before the polls closed at his campaign office, and he said he and Sandy Bellows and Jenny Stevens were all friends beforehand. And they were, they all decided they would continue to be friends afterwards, and it was just a friendly election overall here in the St. Catharines riding. You didn't see that kind of acrimony, and he was saying it's actually an example for the province because some of the ridings in Toronto have been quite nasty. You just didn't see that here.
Did he talk at all, or did you ask him about his legacy? I mean, to be be consistently elected for 41 years, to hold several ministerial positions, to be regarded as the elder statesman of government, is a rare thing in politics, in which your fate can be decided in an eye blink. Did he talk about that at all when you spoke to him tonight?
No, I didn't have a chance to speak with him about that, but we are planning to speak with him tomorrow. Either myself or you will be meeting with him and
right.
and discussing that. Things were a little kind of crazy afterwards. He was actually heading over to Jenny Stevens' campaign to congratulate her.
Okay. Karina Walter, thank you very much and you're going to be updating your story, I imagine, over the next little while?
I will, yes. I'm going to be updating it, and I'm also going to be tomorrow following up on what's going to happen with Jenny Stevens' seat on City Council, because we're losing a Meriton ward councillor.
That's right.
And from talking to the city clerk yesterday, I understand that they have to fill the role within 60 days. But they also, if there is an election coming up, which there is in October, they don't have to if the election is coming up in 90 days. So it's going to be up to City Council what they do with that seat.
Okay. Well, we look forward to read those stories. Thank you very much, Karina Walter.
Thank you.
And that's City Hall reporter Karina Walter, who was with the Jim Bradley campaign tonight and got to speak to him and record his concession speech after 41 years of representing the city of St. Catharines for the Liberal Party. You can watch that concession speech on her Twitter feed and look for her story online, which will be updated shortly with some new material. So we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to track down some of our other colleagues who have been with some of the other campaigns tonight. In particular, we're going to be looking to speak to Alan Benner to find out how, in fact, Jenny Stevens feels having defeated Jim Bradley and now becoming the new NDP MPP for St. Catharines. We'll be back shortly.
You want to come back?
Yep. Okay, we're back, and we're just waiting to get in touch with our reporter, Alan Benner, who's at the Jenny Stevens campaign. Al, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Grant.
Okay, so we got to make this quick because I understand your phone is on life support here.
It very much is, yeah.
So Jenny Stevens is the new MPP. She's beaten Jim Bradley, who's held this post for 41 years. Give us a breakdown on what's happened over there tonight. How's she reacting? What's been said at the Stevens campaign?
It's been an amazing night here. It's began with they seemed, as the results started coming in, showing Jenny ahead. There was almost like, what, really? Oh my God, she's actually winning! This is awesome! And the excitement just built from there. The continue to grow as polls start coming in. Jenny arrived just about the same time that it seemed she was a sure win, and just screams and shouts and cheers. Jenny, Jenny, Jenny. It was really exciting.
Have you had a chance to speak to her yet?
Oh, I have. Yes, yeah, and she was just. That's right. She was just as excited as can be. I mean, just the energy that was coming out of that woman was amazing. Just running around from person to person, hugging every bloody person in the room. It was just something to see.
Did she give you any sense as to whether she understands yet, or had a chance rather to absorb the magnitude of her win, unseating somebody has had as long a career and is as respected as Jim Bradley?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. She was humbled, I think, by the magnitude of what she pulled off. She said that it was just she knew what she was going into, and she worked that much harder to make it happen. And it was a team effort. She said that it was apparent that change was in the air and in St. Catharines, and it was, as she campaigned throughout the past few weeks, it was change for the better, as she said. Yeah.
One of the things that we've been speaking to some of the reporters here about, Alan, is how Niagara has 3 of the 4 ridings have gone NDP, but the province has gone Tory, with Doug Ford forming a majority government. Did you have a chance at all to speak to her about how she's going to approach filling Jim Bradley's shoes in opposition when most of Niagara is not going to have a government representative in the House?
Yeah, she did acknowledge that challenge. It's going to be difficult. It's going to require that much more work, and she's prepared to fight like, as she said, fight like hell for her constituents here in St. Catharines.
All right, Alan, thank you very much. We'll let you go before your phone dies. I know you probably still have some more work to do to file some stories for us, so thanks for your work tonight.
Thank you very much. See you, Grant.
So that was St. Catharines Standard reporter Alan Benner, who was with the Jenny Stevens campaign tonight. Jenny Stevens, of course, one of the big winners in Niagara, unseating 41-year political veteran Jim Bradley. And I see out of the corner of my eye, one of my colleagues, Bill Sawchuk, is just arrived in the house. So, Bill, why don't you come on in, and we'll play one more game of musical chairs with Jeff Bolichowski, if you want to grab a seat. Bill has been he's come a long way to come back to the newsroom. He's been in Niagara West all day at the Oosterhoff campaign. An interesting story for you to cover tonight, because he's the lone island of blue in now a sea of orange. How did he react to his win tonight?
Well, he was, he's very composed, intelligent, kind of magnanimous man. I guess you can afford to be when you've won by more than 10,000 votes.
Yes.
Which is that's a sizable number when you look at some of the other numbers that people are winning by. He's really well ensconced there. He's got a lot of supporters. He's got a lot of staff that help him. He's got a good machine set up. They get the vote out. They get the signs out. He's got a ground game that, for a 20-year-old, he certainly has, kind of built that and nurtured that, and it's going to pay off, I think, now and in the future. He's, in good shape in terms of running.
Did he talk at all about the fact that he's Niagara's now lone government MP?
He didn't, but a number of supporters and people who worked on his campaign were a little bit disappointed at the end. I heard a number of comments of, well, we thought you might have some help, or there might be someone else joining you. But he didn't. He talked mostly about what he wanted for the West Niagara, and his emphasis was on the hospital, getting a hospital up and going there, and the province, and just that he is. And the PC party is kind of a change sea of change for the province.
Is there a sense as to what that change will actually be? One of the things we've been talking tonight is that, and we just heard from Karina, who was relating to us what Jim Bradley had been saying, what he was hearing at the door is, well, we like you, we respect you, but we want somebody different. We want to see change. Did Sam give any indication as to what we might be in for under a PC majority government?
No, it's pretty much the boilerplate stuff that they had been talking about, hydro rates and gas rates and lowering taxes and having a government that, that was his speech. It was a very short speech. Very to the point. He thanked his supporters and God. As you know, that is a big part of Sam. You can't separate the man from his beliefs. But no, not really. Nothing really special. He did talk afterwards. I had a good chance to chat with him. He talked about how it was different this time at the doorstep for him. That he was much more recognized. He felt much more accepted by a number of people. Whereas the first time through in the by-election, a lot of the questions were about him. This time around, he said a lot of the questions were about Doug Ford and that kind of Ford Nation and how whether he fits in with that.
Well, and that's an interesting point. I mean, we've been covering that since he first put his name forward and won the nomination for the riding and by-election and now the election. There was some consternation in the PC party during this campaign as to whether or not Doug Ford still had the confidence of the social conservatives in the party, of which Mr. Oosterhoff is definitely a part. When it comes to that question of is he part of Ford Nation, is he part of this particular iteration of the PC party, what is your sense of that, and does he feel like he's an insider or an outsider at this point?
I think what I kind of have to sidestep it a bit and just say that time will tell. The one thing if victory papers over a lot of problems.
That's true.
And a lot of a lot of discrepancies. Those kinds of things, disputes tend to kind of fall away when you're in the midst of a massive victory. When you're in defeat, they tend to rip apart and exacerbate. So time will tell with him. He was part of kind of Christine Elliott's team.
Yes.
That when she was running for the leadership. So, in the sense of what we've seen before when people have, been involved in leadership races, local MPPs, they tend to be on the outs if they supported the other person. But whether they take advantage of Sam's particular talents, I guess we'll see exactly where he stands in the party in the weeks and months to come.
Do you still have some more work to do tonight to update your story?
I do. I've got a lot to do.
Okay. Well, Bill, thanks very much for stopping in to see us. I won't keep you too much longer.
Awesome.
Get those files.
Yeah,
get those stories filed.
Back from the wilds of Smithville.
Wilds of
safely,
Smithville, safe and sound.
Safe and following the speed limits.
That's reporter Bill Sawchuk, who was with the Sam Oosterhoff campaign tonight and covering the results from Niagara West. Sam Oosterhoff, of course, has won a convincing victory in the riding. He is Niagara's lone government MPP for the PC party. For those, again, who maybe just be joining us or just catching up on the news, the PC party under leader Doug Ford has won a majority government at Queen's Park. Anywhere in the neighborhood of 74 to 73 seats, 63 seats are needed for a majority government. And the NDP will become the official opposition with around 40 seats. There's still a few ridings left with polls outstanding, so we may not know these numbers 100% yet. And the Liberal Party is no longer in government, and they are flirting with the possibility that they may not even have official party status by the end of the day. So that's the news for the province. Locally, Niagara has voted orange, despite the fact that most of the province has gone blue. 3 of our 4 ridings in Niagara have, in fact, gone NDP. St. Catharines, Niagara Center, and Niagara Falls have all elected NDP members. As you just heard, Sam Oosterhoff in Niagara West is the only PC candidate to remain standing in Niagara. And where he will actually sit in the new government of Doug Ford is something that's yet to be seen. What is your expectation, Jeff, as to what this government is going to look like? One of the criticisms of this party was that its platform was a little bit nebulous. It was hanging on things like $1 a beer or 10 cents off gas, things that the government may not actually be able to do or control. What do you expect is going to happen once things kind of settle down and they have to get down to the job of governing?
I think one of the first things you're going to hear is probably one of the first things that any party was going to say is they're going to get in and look at the books and say, this is a lot worse than we thought. You know, we need to rethink things. You know, maybe some of the things we were talking about during the election have to be rethought a little bit. Maybe that's a good idea as to why we didn't release a platform. I mean, obviously voters were looking for a platform, but at the same time, it also didn't matter all that much considering the margin of victory. So he's going to have to really sit down, do a little bit of math, and figure out where he goes from here. One of his signature promises was to find 4 cents on the dollar for every dollar of spending in Ontario. He's going to have to figure out how he's going to do that. He's going to have to figure out if he's going to be able to hire an auditor, where that fat's going to come from, if he's going to be able to make that through cuts, or if he's going to be able to do that through attrition or other efficiencies. So he's really going to have to sit down and figure out how he's going to do everything he's promised to do, and we'll see at that point how many of his election promises stick.
It's curious, isn't it, that we make such a big deal, and maybe this is us as journalists, or yourself as a former journalist, now working in strategic comms. We sort of live in the bubble. We're not always seeing things the way, sort of, the average citizen may see them, and we tend to make a big deal over, well, is your platform costed? What are the details of your platform? And as you say, it didn't seem to make that much of a difference this time around for the PC party to have a detailed platform and plan they could present to the public, whereas the NDP and the Liberals certainly did. Why do you think that didn't matter so much?
I think it's just because of the style of the campaign. Personalities quickly overrode any issues of policy. You heard very little about fiscal responsibility, for instance. One of the most interesting things was the absence of fiscal conservatism in this campaign. You heard very little about concrete plans, and most of it was about, our party is scared of Doug Ford because X, our party is scared of Andrew Horwath because Y. So it quickly became a campaign of which party are you more scared of? And it looks like Doug Ford was a lot better at mobilizing his voters than the NDP were at mobilizing theirs. Which, again, isn't much of a surprise because Doug Ford's voter base was always much more likely to turn out.
What do you make of the voter turnout? You and I were watching that quite closely through the night, and at first it seemed abysmal, but as the number of polls were reporting in, that number, of course, ticked up because when you look at the Elections Ontario website, the total number of voter turnout, the percentage of it anyway, that's a percentage of the votes counted at that point, so you don't know till the end comes in. Everything is now looking around 50% or up, at least provincially.
Yeah, maybe 55.
Yeah, and around Niagara, I mean, we had on the board, we're looking at the low seems to be Niagara Center, the high being St. Catharines, at least last time we looked, which was creeping up to about 60%. What do you make of those figures?
Well, Ford's probably going to add about 600 to 700,000 votes to the PC's total from last time around, and that's a significant amount. He's broken 2 million votes at this point. That is not a small amount of voters, and what it shows is that anger motivates people to the polls a lot better than certain other forms of persuasion. You had an angry electorate, and Doug Ford managed to capture the candidate of angry.
How interestingly, if voters wanted change because they were angry, does that have the potential to backfire on the PC party if they can't do, even in the general sense that they were discussing it in the campaign, if they can't do what they said they're going to do?
It's hard to say. A lot of populist candidates tend to be very Teflon and very immune to conventional scandal the way we saw it. And you saw that with the breaking news about Renata Ford and the lawsuit against Doug Ford. It didn't move the dial at all. If anything, it made Ford supporters more likely to go out and vote for him. I think there's a certain block of voters, the Ford Nation voters, so to speak, who will give him a chance no matter what he does, who will love him because he's a straight shooter, who like him because he had some signature policies that seem to resonate with the little guy. And I think you're going to see people give him a lot of rope.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much, Jeff. And I think that's where we're going to end our broadcast tonight. Just to give you one final quick recap, the Provincial Conservative Party of Ontario has formed a majority government, and the NDP will be the official opposition, and the Liberal Party has been cast into third place and perhaps will even lose official party status by the time all the votes have been counted. And we may actually be looking for the first time at a Green Party candidate sitting at Queen's Park. Locally, the PCs won Niagara West. There was no surprise there. Sam Oosterhoff held on to the seat he won in the by-election. But the rest of the region voted NDP. Niagara Falls, Niagara Center, and St. Catharines all chose NDP candidates. And in this particular case in St. Catharines, the longest-serving member of the provincial parliament, Jim Bradley of the Liberal Party, has lost, and he's being replaced by Jenny Stevens, a city councillor who ran for the NDP. I'm Grant LaFleche, and this broadcast has been brought to you by WeeStream And it has been also brought to you by your Torstar and Metroland newspapers, the St. Catharines Standard, the Welland Tribune, the Niagara Falls Review, and of course our weekly newspapers at Niagara This Week. I'm Grant LaFleche. Good night.